Welcome to the last day of Hope and Healing for Mental Health here on 100 Huntley Street. What an incredible week it's been. Daniel, it's been an incredible privilege to have you here as our guest co-host all week.
Oh, I've loved it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you've been amazing, and you have so much wisdom to share, you know, and we're going to dive in a little bit today on a new topic, social media, not new in terms of mental health, but you know, you can't talk about this without bringing up the impact social media has had. And I was shocked to realize it's been around for more than 20 years. So this great social experiment we embarked on, we're starting to measure both the good and, unfortunately, the bad.
Yeah, and statistics show that people who are on their screens for 7 hours or more a day are nearly twice as likely to experience severe symptoms of anxiety, depression, and psychological stress than those who limit their screen time to a maximum of 3 hours.
And now your phone, many phones will actually measure that time for you, and it might be more than you think. Now, of course, young people by far are on their screens the most, and they are, stats show, experiencing the most severe mental health symptoms. Experts believe those two could be strongly connected. But how do you keep them off their phones in this day and age? Now, you are the parent of a preteen teen. Yes. What do you do? What's your answer?
My wife and I work really hard. It's a daily battle. But I think the key is to be really boundaried in how we steward this technology. And I think stewardship is the key. In Genesis, God calls us to steward things. And I think we can't just let it go. We have to think, where do we use screens? When don't we use screens? How do we steward them? So we're very boundaried.
That's good. I like that. Well, Australia's come up with a boundary as well, this strategy to help their youth. They banned social media for anyone under 16, which is really amazing because they're recognizing the mental health harms. But that restriction is actually being challenged in court by Reddit. So we'll see what happens there.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I also thought the statistic was very interesting where it says 53% of youth said they felt compelled to maintain a successful image on social media, and 65% believed they were falling behind their peers financially. So by projecting a successful image that may not match reality, they're making everyone else feel like they don't measure up, which really doesn't help.
Right? That comparison game is so huge and it's hard. It's that highlight reel versus the reality of what life is really like. And, you know, none of us post our full truth on socials, nor should we. Like talking about boundaries, it's not the place to tell everything about your life. But I think no matter what your age, actually, limiting that temptation of comparison by comparing ourselves to others, by reducing our exposure to socials is not a bad idea.
Yeah, and it's definitely a conversation we need to keep having. Well, Cheryl, you recently travelled to the Chalet Mental Health Summit in Toronto to speak to my friend, Dr. Rod Wilson, who has been exploring how our faith intersects with our mental health. It's such an important topic. So let's go to that interview now.
I'm joined now by Dr. Rod Wilson, a psychologist, researcher, and author. He served as a pastor in various churches and as president of Regent College from 2000 to 2015. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's nice to be with you.
It's great to be with you, and I'm so interested in your work in the intersection of faith and mental health in particular. You have a PhD in clinical counseling psychology, a degree in theology. So bringing faith into clinical psychology, what gifts does that give?
Yeah, I think the fancy theological word is anthropology, the nature of what it means to be human. I think in psychology, we learn about what it means to be human, what it means to function well, what it means to flourish, what it means to not flourish, to not function well, to have dysfunction. So we learn about that, I think, a lot in the secular sphere of psychology. But then I think in the Christian sphere, there's a more rooted sense of who we are, like who God is, who we are. What it means to be a follower of Jesus. And what I realized is that in some parts of psychology, there was kind of an absence of a spirituality or a transcendence or an otherworldly approach. But on the other side, I found in some aspects of Christian faith, it wasn't really true to who we were humanly. And so I actually found both sides had a lack. And to be able to let them contribute to one another was really helpful. And I still find that. I still find often in churches, there's churches that kind of specialize on the spiritual and they minimize the human. And there's a lot of churches now that are maximizing the human and minimizing the spiritual. But true integration, for me, was taking my humanity and my spirituality seriously.
Now, knowing that these are your fields of interest and study, And you've been talking about this and exploring it. And then you yourself have been very open about the fact that you were diagnosed with low-grade depression. So how is that impacting your experience as you process that diagnosis and how to move forward?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. From a very young child, I had this sense that I was carrying, and it felt like carrying it, that I was carrying this low-grade heaviness. You know, when you have a low-grade fever, it's not like raging. It's just a little, you can still function, you can still do fine, but you have this low-grade fever. And it wasn't until I went to a psychiatrist and actually had a fair bit of psychotherapy and then was diagnosed medication, I began to realize that part of my journey, not something to run from or not something to necessarily ignore or pretend wasn't there, but my dysthymia, my low-grade depression, is part of who I am. And if I had diabetes, you know, if I needed a knee replacement or I had a sinus infection, I would go for help with that. And the therapy that I've had and the medication that I take has really helped my dysthymia in a very good way. I still struggle with dysthymia, but it's not jeopardizing my life. It's not getting in the way of what I need to do. Even in serving God, it doesn't get in the way. And I think what it reminds me, like I think at the core, we're all vulnerable. And we're all tainted by just being human. And for me, my dysthymia is one aspect of me being tainted, me being not quite perfect, you know, not quite like the Creator. Surprise, surprise. You know, I have liabilities. I have things that I'm falling short on.
No, you're so right. I think we all are dealing with so many different areas of pain and woundedness. And I know you've been on a journey with your daughter as well. Can you tell me a little bit about her?
Yeah, our daughter was born 37 years ago, and she has hydrocephalus and frontal lobe brain damage, and she's autistic and started puberty when she was 2. So the package of things that she brings to the world, a lot of it related to neuroscience and to cognitive issues, it means this, you know, competent, well-trained psychologist has frailty as a dad. I can't fix my daughter. I can't solve all her problems. That's been a profound spiritual lesson for me, that my journey with my daughter is one of presence, one of walking alongside. It's not one of being the sage on the stage. It's not one of providing all the solutions, all the answers. So while a lot of it's been painful for her because she's, you know, the product of some dysfunction in her brain, I think for me what it's done is it's been a humbling experience, but also an experience where I'm invited to be present and be with rather than solve and fix. And there's nothing like that. I think a lot of the parents watching will have that experience too. Most of us want to fix our children and solve our children's problems, but to walk alongside your child that's got chronic issues is a powerful spiritual lesson. So I tell my daughter sometimes I've learned more about God from being in relationship with you than anything else I've learned, including my theological training.
Wow, that's an amazing statement. And I think you're right. I mean, men in particular, right? You want to fix things. That's your job. Yeah. Slay dragons, fix things.
Yeah.
When you see her suffer, what is your understanding of God in that moment?
Yeah. Well, you know, I've read the Bible chronologically, you know, like there was Jesus' birth and his life and his betrayal and the Garden of Gethsemane and then the crucifixion and then the resurrection and then the consummation. But what I try to do is stop at those places in my relationship with God and say, a lot of my parenting journey has been a Garden of Gethsemane. It hasn't been a resurrection story. A lot of my journey has been pain. And her journey too, not just mine and my wife's journey, but her journey as well. So I think as a Christian, walking alongside somebody who's got pain and is in, you know, has chronic issues they're dealing with, not a crisis, these are chronic issues, you learn that God's promise is not, I will be the fixer of all your problems, I will be the solver of all your difficulties, but God's promise is, I will never leave you, I will never forsake you. And so what I've learned as a dad is that belonging is what matters most. I want to feel like I belong to her. I want her to feel like she belongs to me. And sometimes when we get into the fixing solution game, we forget the belonging and the connection. And it's mutual. Like by some standards, she's much lesser than me, but by other standards, I think I'm much lesser than her.
That's amazing. And I love how you unpack the gifts that pain even has given you. You know, you're a trained theologian. I think a lot of us run from pain, especially here in Western society.
Yeah.
We're not taught a lot about it. We're not always prepared for it.
Yeah.
How can people watching process pain, whether it's mental illness or a situation with someone they love or a situation in their own life?
Yeah. Well, I love Genesis 6:6. I love it in the sense that I find it the most confusing verse in the Bible. God regretted that he had made people, and his heart was filled with pain. And I read that verse, Genesis 6:6, and I think, as a dad, I understand that verse. Like, God was in pain as our father when he saw what his children had done, when he saw the pain and brokenness they were in. His heart was filled with pain. When I see Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, I feel like that's a Jesus I can follow as somebody who's got my own brokenness and my parenting. I look at when they came and told Jesus that John the Baptist had died, and that lovely little phrase, Jesus went off by himself. Like, obviously a good friend, somebody that in utero, there was some communication with him and John the Baptist, and he went away and had that experience of sadness. So it's given me an understanding of God, I think, that God is in our pain and God is with us in our pain and isn't always extracting us from it. We don't always triumph over it. We're not always victorious over it. I think sometimes some of us are given parts of life that are not crisis-oriented, they're chronically oriented. And I think, some crises can go away quickly, but chronic pain needs someone who's present, right? Because in chronic pain, we feel isolated. We feel alone. We feel like, who's with me in this? Like, my journey as a dad, I've been in this 37 years. Like, people can be with you in a crisis, but can they be with you? And that's God's promise. He never slumbers. He never sleeps. He's present in the chronic, even though the chronic may not go away.
Wow. And I think when we take that and apply it to a mental health lens in the church, it's not always trying to fix people there either, right?
Yeah.
How do we apply that?
Yeah. Well, I think because sermons are our major mode of communication in church life, and, we all listen to sermons on Sunday or give sermons on Sunday, I think there's a sense in which the sermon sometimes runs the risk of not knowing the stories on the other end. Like, sitting in that congregation or 150 people or whatever it is, they all have a story. And so when we're preaching a sermon, we need to remember that this passage of Scripture and this theological construct we're kind of unpack is being heard by people with different stories. And so if somebody's talking about, isn't it amazing, children are a gift from God, and how amazing parenting is, there'll be some people sitting there that are struggling with infertility. There are people struggling there who've got a problem child. There are people struggling there who've had a child that's taken their own life. So we need to preach and teach with a recognition of the stories that may be there, and be careful not to individualize these sermons so much that people feel re-traumatized when they're listening to a sermon.
That's a word of wisdom. And, you talk about having a narrative grid for Christian ministry. Is that kind of what you mean when you talk about the power of encompassing everyone's story?
Yeah, I'm impressed, Cheryl, in the Gospels that Jesus didn't preach a bunch of sermons. What he did was had conversations with people, and they told stories, and he told stories. And some of the stories Jesus told, the people who heard them didn't even understand them. They were confused by them. And he spoke in riddles, and he spoke in parables, and he used funny metaphors at times. But it's a story dialogue. So story is part of what we need to do. Like, even the work you do, a lot of your work is listening to people's stories. And there's something powerful as your listeners watch that. Hearing stories is really what the Bible is about. I mean, the Bible in many ways is a book of stories. They're true stories, but they're still stories. And I think concepts are very much an end, whereas story is ongoing, right? There's something ongoing about story that makes us more connected and gives us a greater sense of belonging. If you know my story, you know me. If I know your story, I know you.
That's so wise. I really love one of your recent books. I have to shift gears for a minute here. You called it, Thank You, I'm Sorry, Tell Me More, How to Change the World with 3 Sacred Sayings. And this is a little bit also about how to open up people's hearts. Can you unpack those 3 phrases a little bit more?
Yeah, I think right now in this present cultural moment, we've lost a sense of gratitude, and we're very much into entitlement. So I'm not thankful for you. I just believe you need to do this because I'm entitled for it. So I think the antidote to a culture of entitlement is gratitude, and the best way to express gratitude is thank you. I think we're also living in a culture of victimization, where I don't take any responsibility for what I've done wrong. I just blame my parents, my background, my history, my church, Christians, whatever. I'm always victimized by everything. And in a culture of victimization, we need more remorse. We need more repentance. I need to say to you, like Cheryl, in that interaction we had last week, I'm sorry for what I said. And I don't want to blame. I don't want to do a but. I'm sorry, but.
I'm sorry for what I said, but you said blah,
yeah,
blah, blah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so what I want to do is speak into that culture of victimization with an expression of remorse. And the tell me more phrase is, we're in a culture where everyone wants to tell their own story, right? Like, you need to hear my story. This is my story. This is my experience. This is my lived experience, which is great. But if all I do is tell you my story, I don't say to you, tell me more. I don't ask you to tell me more. So my little title of that book, Thank You, I'm Sorry, Tell Me More, How to Change the World with 3 Sacred Sayings, is basically to say to everybody, not just Christians, if we said thank you more, said I'm sorry more, and said tell me more, we would be more connected and less fragmented. And even myself using these 3 phrases in the last number of years and writing that book, it's just amazing the things that have opened up. I was at a restaurant, and I have this little joke. My friends know this about me. I love dessert. So when the waiter or waitress comes to the table after the main course and says, would you like dessert? I say, is the Pope Catholic? And, just trying to be funny, because of course I want dessert. I'm going to have dessert. So this young woman, turns out she was about 19. She said, is he? And I said, what? Is the Pope Catholic? And I said, tell me more. So we had this long conversation for about 20 minutes about religion. And she didn't know who the Pope was. She didn't know what Catholic was. She didn't know what Protestant was. I said, do you have any exposure to the church? None at all. She said, well, why are you here? And I said, I'm doing a Bible conference. What's that? And so we had this amazing conversation just because I said, is the Pope Catholic? She said, is he? And I said, tell me more. Right? And when we do those little phrases of thank you, I'm sorry, tell me more, open up a lot of conversational space that I think brings us closer to one another in a world that's really fragmented right now.
There's so much to unpack there, but I think the listening piece too, the tell me more. I have a friend who's an executive coach, and he says, sometimes I feel like people pay me just to listen to them because nobody listens anymore.
Yeah.
What is the power of allowing somebody to genuinely unpack their story without judgment or interrupting or, rushing to critique them?
Yeah. Well, I think, here I would go back to my theological convictions. Like, if we're creating the image of God, there's a certain dignity in who we are. So if you say to me, do you have any children? I say, yeah, I have a 37-year-old daughter. And then you just go along about your day and never say, tell me more. But if you say, tell me more, and I tell you the richness of that experience and the complexity of that experience and the pain for her and the struggle for my wife and myself, that gives you much more connection with me and gives you a sense of understanding the complexity which is my life. And there's a dignity in that as somebody creating the image of God that will draw me closer to you because you want to know who I am.
Ooh, I think that's a really good thought to end on. Dr. Wilson, thank you so much for your time and sharing just a little bit of your wisdom with us.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. I enjoyed being with you.
Thanks. I so enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Wilson, and I think this is one of the things I learned from the extroverts in my life, because believe it or not, introvert. So if I was at the grocery store, I would just pay. I probably wouldn't say too much, but I've learned that asking people questions, seeing them, that can make the whole difference in their day. And people actually love to talk about themselves. And so I had an extrovert friend who would always build connections and people would always remember her. And I started watching her as the introvert to try to figure out why. She said, because people love to talk about themselves and they feel connected to you when you listen. Exactly what he said. That actually makes a difference. Now, that's one thing that I took from his interview is always tell me more. That art of listening. What did you take?
Yeah, there's so much that I love about what Rod presented there. And I think, again, just his brutal honesty about the struggles in his life and not feeling the need to explain them away in a simple way, but just to let them be, I think is just so powerful.
That's what I loved about this week the most, actually, is the complexity of life. You know, all these amazing interviews that we had, they didn't just dismiss it or wrap it up in a neat bow, but they were honest about it. And I think that's a great example for all of us. Well, you know, over this week, we've been unpacking the 5 pillars that Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries trains people on. We're on the 5th one today, and this one is a little convicting for me. I have to be honest. Self-care as a sacred practice. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I think often self-care immediately can put people's backs up, particularly as Christians, where we're told to be willing to sacrifice ourselves and to lay our lives down. The idea of self-care can feel really foreign, but at its core, the idea of self-care is that it's not a selfish act. It's actually an act of stewardship. It's caring for someone that God has declared as good, and that's me. And often we are willing to see the sanctity of human life as long as it's other people, but we're not willing to see our own. So self-care is not a selfish act, it's good stewardship. And also Jesus commands it. You know, when Jesus is asked what's the greatest commandment, and Jesus says, love God and love others as self. So we love God, we love others, but as self requires a certain degree of self-care.
That might be why sometimes we're not great at loving others, because we're not great at loving ourselves.
I agree.
Okay, I'm just going to be honest. It feels like there's a nobility toward denying myself, you know, especially like when I'm working around the world in traumatic situations. People are in situations so much worse than me. Yeah. I know I have to care enough to survive the experience, like drink enough water so I don't pass out so I can do my job. What is wrong in our thinking that we feel like it's noble to neglect ourselves?
Yeah. I think, at its most extreme example, you could take the example of the martyrs, the early church fathers, people who actively laid down their lives for their faith. People would say to me, well, were the martyrs practicing self-care? And what I would say is, well, that was a vocation they were called to. They were called by God to lay down their life in those moments. And if I'm called, I hope I would do the same thing. But you don't pursue martyrdom, right? Yeah. And actually, we can't give what we ourselves don't have. If you don't steward who you are and care for yourself, how can you give to others in a way that's really going to help them?
Yeah, and actually they couldn't steward themselves. If they didn't steward themselves to make sure that they could last until the moment of martyrdom to do the work they were supposed to do, they wouldn't have made it. Yeah. So I do agree. Now you talk about 4 areas that self-care encompasses. What are those 4 areas?
Yeah, so it really goes back to this idea of the biopsychosocial spiritual reality that we are. A human being is always biological, always psychological, always social, always spiritual. So when you think about it from those different aspects, how do I care for my biology? How do I care for my body? What do I eat? Do I exercise? Do I get fresh air? Do I go outside each day? These are just practical biological things. And then psychology, what am I putting into my brain and how am I caring for this amazing complex organ that God has fearfully and wonderfully made? And how am I stewarding my relationships with other people? Who am I surrounding myself with? Who am I not surrounding myself with? And then our spiritual lives. How are we nurturing and caring for our spiritual realities?
That's a lot of work.
It can feel like it. But, you know, when I go for a walk outside, I am caring to all of those things. When I look at God's creation, as I walk around, as I meet people that God has made, I'm caring to my physical self, my spiritual self, my relational self. So we're holistic.
So it's almost like people need to take a moment and really look at those 4 areas and say, how am I doing in those 4 areas? Where am I short? What do I need to adjust? And I would think it's always kind of this adjusting life, because we're never going to get it exactly right.
Yeah, and it can feel overwhelming as I sit here and talk about biopsychosocial spiritual. But in truth, we know these things. We know that it's good for us to be with other people. We know how good it feels to look someone in the eye and share a joke or a laugh with them. We know this. So I think it's just, as you say, little adjustments, little steps in the right direction. And
you say, you know, show yourself the same kindness you would show a friend. And it's interesting. It's one of the things that I talk a lot to when I'm coaching leaders is like the way we talk to ourselves.
Yes.
We would never speak to anyone else like that. Like, you're such an idiot. I can't believe you did that. You know, like, what are some examples of some things that we say to ourselves that is so disrespectful and shouldn't be?
Yes, I know. Well, if I'm really candid myself, if I analyze that, I'll often talk to myself at a point of kind of crisis where I'll say, come on, Daniel. It's almost like, pull yourself together. And that I don't ever go, good job. Daniel, that was amazing. Well done. I never say that. I'm always like, pull yourself together, man. So I think if we really analyze it, for whatever reason, we can fall into this trap of speaking negatively to ourselves. And it doesn't, as you say, you'd never say that to a friend or a loved one.
It's true. Actually, Dove soap did this campaign in Europe where it had people journal what they say to themselves. And then they hired actors and actresses to sit in a cafe outdoors and say it to each other. And people around them were saying, you can't do that. What are you doing? That's abuse, whatever. And it was kind of trying to make the point of how we speak to ourselves. And there's actually a mental health benefit towards saying good things to ourselves, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. There absolutely is. And I think often we read like verses of scripture about God calling us loved and chosen and called, and we know how good that feels. And I think we know how good that feels when someone we value and respect says that to us, and it's the same when we say it to ourselves.
The training that Sanctuary Mental Health Ministries gives is so good. And, we're such huge fans of the work that you do. I just want to let people know a little bit about some of the resources you have available. Now, what's the website people can go to if they've been watching last week going, what is this organization? I want to use its resources.
Yeah, so sanctuarymentalhealth.org is our website. The good news is all our resources are free. You can just access them. And they're designed for church small groups, for parachurch small groups, for leadership teams, for anyone really to pick up resources that help people have better conversations about faith and mental health. We have resources for young people as well. We have the Sanctuary Youth Series for 11 to 15-year-olds. We have a worship album of music that churches are now singing in their churches. So there's a lot of cool resources you can see.
What's unique about the music relating to mental health? Is it positivity? Is it lament?
So all of the songs were inspired by people's lived experience. So I think about one of the songs is a song called Christ is Lower Still, which Matt Maher and Grammy winner Doe sing. And it's this beautiful song that speaks of the Christ who meets us in the depths. Not the Christ who tries to pull us out, but the Christ who's there waiting for us when we go to those deep places.
That's what Dr. Wilson said, is like, God isn't the one who's solving all my problems. He's the one who's with me no matter what I'm facing. I thought that was so wise. And we want to remind you again of our free mental health and faith and mental health Bible study. It's 5 days of digging into what the Bible has to say about our mental health. You might not even know that the Bible actually addresses mental health. So this is an amazing journey for you to take. And it also includes videos of faith experts unpacking this topic. So please make sure to write down this URL. You can download it right there at crossroads.ca/study guide.
Yes, and do make sure to write down our prayer line number as well, which is an incredible resource for support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Not only will the most wonderful people pray for you, but they can also connect you to a faith community or other resources that may help you on your healing journey. Please call 1-866-273-4444 or go to prayer@crossroads.ca or chat@crossroads.ca with our digital pastor.
We have 30 seconds left. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but what's one thought you want to leave with people out of everything we've discussed this week about mental health? What's one encouragement?
I would say to people watching this, you are not alone. If you're in the midst of the depths, in the midst of the crisis, you have a Saviour who's with you, and you have a community of people, many of whom are going through the same things, who would say to you, we are with you.
Yeah, we all are on a mental health continuum. That's my takeaway from this week. And we're all going to have highs and lows, but God is with us in all of it. I hope you've been encouraged this week. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for your ongoing support of Crossroads, a supporter-funded nonprofit organization and member of the Canadian Centre for Christian Charities. Thanks to faithful people like you, we are able to continue producing 100 Huntley Street. You can write to Crossroads, P.O. Box 5100, Burlington, Ontario, L7R4M2, or visit crossroads.ca to learn more about our programs.
What if your favorite hymns held stories you've never heard? In The Origin of Hymns, It Is Well With My Soul, pastor and author Robert J. Morgan takes you into the powerful, untold moments behind the world's most beloved hymns.
For generations, these timeless hymns have lifted hearts and voices. That's why I'm excited to partner with 100 Huntley Street and Crossroads this month to thank you for your continued support of this life-giving ministry. When you understand the story behind a hymn, it changes how you sing it. it becomes personal, a whole new kind of worship. These songs didn't come from comfort. They were born out of real life, out of grief, struggle, and a deep, unshakable faith in God.
With a gift of $50 or more, or when you become a new monthly partner, request your copy. Call 1-800-265-3100 or visit crossroads.ca/hymns.